Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. A survey by the Electoral Commission has found that many South Africans would happily consider living under a dictatorship, just as long as basic human rights remained intact and fixed the country's problems. Now, the IEC found that the citizens are feeling dejected by a worsening perception of failure of multi-party democracy and dysfunctional public institutions. Now, joining us now to discuss such a political scenario is the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation's head of Research and Policy and core partner director for Southern Africa at Afro Barometer, Jan Hofmeyr. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. This research shows a growing number of South Africans willing and open to some form of bargaining, opting to forego their democratic right to vote in exchange for being led by a dictator. That's just as long as their basic human rights are met. That's quite startling. How did you get to these revelations?
All right. Maybe just one correction. These findings were presented at a workshop of the Independent Electoral Commission. And these particular findings come from the Afrobarometer survey, round 8 of the Afrobarometer survey. And the question that we ask respondents during the survey is not as stark as a choice between a dictatorship or a democracy, but we posed the question to ordinary South Africans. If you had to choose, would you want to have a government elected through free and fair elections, or would you rather have a government where the leadership is not elected, but they are strong in terms of their decision-making powers and they've got a lot of discretion in terms of making those powers? So an elected versus an unelected government. And what we've seen there is that the vast majority of South Africans still prefer to have a democratic dispensation. In fact, about 2/3 of our respondents, or 67%, indicated that they prefer to live in a democratic state. But what we've seen, on the other hand, is that there has been a growth over the years, because remember, Afrobarometer also track these findings over the years, that there has been an increase in the number of respondents who've indicated that they would prefer a government that is not necessarily elected, but is strong and able to make decisions that can quickly turn their lives around.
So over the years, what has worsened the growing disillusionment?
I think there are a number of factors. I think the first one that one has to say is that globally, democracy is struggling. We're seeing it all across the world. Just this weekend, Italy is going to the polls, and there is a very strong likelihood that a party that is fascist may become the leading party in a coalition. So this is something that we're seeing across the world. It has largely got to do with economic reasons, greater levels of inequality in societies, elites prospering at the expense of people at the bottom. And I think in South Africa, we've seen similar things: high levels of inequality, low economic growth, particularly over the past decade, and then specifically in the wake of the pandemic. And so people feel dejected, they feel hopeless, they feel as if they do not necessarily have a recourse. Now, whether this is the fault of democracy as a system or not, I would argue that it is not. It is rather the functioning of the system, and particularly things like oversight and accountability in our system that is not working properly, because you cannot have a government elected, but between elections have very little oversight in terms of whether executing their mandate or not.
So in expanding on the research, according to the 2021 data, the most disillusioned among the participants were those within the age groups of 18 to 24, with 71% of them expressing the sentiment. This is not encouraging at all, despite the efforts to encourage young people to make their voices heard at the ballot box. What does it mean now for the future of South African voters?
Well, I think, this is not a surprising finding for us, that the majority of those who feel disillusioned are in the younger age categories. These are particularly young people who leave school or tertiary institutions, are some qualified still struggle to find jobs, and that leads to disillusionment and also a withdrawal from the system because they feel that the system does not work for them. And I think a number of things are important. The one thing is I think we should up on democracy as a system. What we, for example, see is that many of our respondents prefer protest as a way of expressing themselves politically, and that is good, but protests focus on specific areas or specific issues. And if we want to ensure that governments who generally perform badly do not continue to govern, the elections are the only way to remove those people from power. So I think it is really important for us now to strengthen our oversight institutions, our institutions that ensure accountability, transparency in the system. Otherwise, we will continue to see high levels of corruption and maladministration without any sanction for those that are responsible.
Just yesterday, former DA leader Mmusi Maimane launched the political party Build One South Africa. And as you speak about young people and their concerns around the economy, around jobs, he's promised jobs in every home. What does research indicate about the new kids on the block, so to speak, when it comes to promises that really would make a difference to young people, especially as we look at this research, speaking to a 71% of them who are disillusioned?
Look, I think the focus on job creation, employment, is a pivotal one, and it is laudable that Mr. Maimane is also targeting that as a campaign area. What our research shows is that if we ask South Africans, what is the one area that you would like government to change immediately, it would be the question of unemployment. Unemployment is by far the most important issue on the minds of ordinary South Africans. I think for Mr. Maimane himself, it will really also depend on the extent to which he will be able to mobilize his campaign. We know that he has been active over the past year or so through his One South Africa campaign. But the question is whether he would be able also to upscale that in order to compete with parties that are well-resourced to conduct these kinds of campaigns.
Mm-hmm. And it shows that with a lot of people now moving away from those patriotic sentiments, that this research clearly indicates that there has been a major shift from the national pride of the early 1990s. What does it mean for the future, or perhaps the trends that may be kicking in?
Yeah, look, I think what we've seen over years is during periods where economic growth is slow, where people lose their jobs, where poverty levels go up, people's optimism and sentiment towards the country is generally sort of going down. So people are feeling more hopeless now than they have felt close to 30 years ago when we had our first democratic elections. So I think what needs to be done is to focus on those things that we can change, that is within our power to change. And that is the one thing, is to ensure that we have accountability in our system again, where we can be proud of our leaders who perform and execute their mandate according to what the electorate has given to them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for giving us a breakdown of this research. That is core partner director for Southern Africa at Afrobarometer, Hofmeyr, speaking about that research. Let's take you to